Sometimes the things we're meant to find come to us when we're no longer looking. 65-year-old Silas Greer had walked past that old barn 100 times, never giving it much thought, until the day he heard something stirring inside. What he discovered would change everything. Over 200 abandoned donkeys, left to die by a bankrupt breeder in a town too busy to notice. Most men would have turned away. Silas didn't. With nothing but an old trailer, a small pension, and a heart bigger than his means, he decided those forgotten animals deserved a second chance. What unfolded became a testament to the quiet power of simple compassion. But could one man with nothing really transform an entire town? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The October wind carried the scent of dry grass and distant rain across the high desert of eastern Oregon, where the town of Prospect Ridge sat like a handful of scattered stones against the endless sweep of sagebrush and sky. It was the kind of place where everyone knew your name, but few knew your story, where the hardware store doubled as the coffee shop, and where the last movie theater had closed in 1987. 342 souls called it home, most of them descendants of the same families who'd settled there a century ago, when the railroad promised prosperity that never quite arrived. Silas Greer had lived in Prospect Ridge for going on 4 decades, though he'd never quite felt like he belonged. He wasn't born there, for one thing, and in a town where bloodlines ran deep as well water, that mattered. He drifted into town in his late 20s, following a bad divorce and a string of ranch jobs that had taken him from Montana to Nevada and points between. He'd meant to stay a season, maybe 2, but seasons had a way of turning into years when you weren't paying attention, and before he knew it, his dark hair had gone silver, and his strong back had started to remind him of its limitations. He lived in a single-wide trailer on the edge of town, set back from County Road 47 on a 1/4 acre of packed earth and struggling juniper trees. The trailer had been old when he bought it 15 years ago, cream-colored, with a brown stripe and windows that rattled in the wind. Inside, it was clean and spare, a narrow kitchen with laminate counters, a small living room with a recliner pointed at a television that mostly played westerns and nature documentaries, a bedroom barely big enough for a double bed. The walls held few decorations, a calendar from the feed store, a photograph of his mother standing beside a corral in better days, and a shadow box containing his father's pocket watch. The watch was a simple thing, silver and tarnished, its face frozen at 3:47. That was the time his father had died, 42 years ago now, collapsed in a barn in Wyoming, with his heart giving out like an old engine finally seizing up. Silas had been 23, working a ranch 2 counties over, and by the time he got the call and made the drive, his father was already in the ground. He'd never gotten to say goodbye, never gotten to tell him that he understood now why the old man had worked himself to exhaustion, trying to hold onto a piece of land that the bank wanted more than he did. The watch was all he had left, and he kept it in that shadow box like a pressed flower, something beautiful and dead and impossibly distant. Most mornings, Silas was up before dawn. His body didn't need an alarm anymore. 65 years of ranch work had programmed his bones to wake when the world was still dark and quiet. He'd make coffee in the ancient percolator on the stove, strong enough to strip paint, and sit at the small kitchen table watching the sky lighten through the window. The view wasn't much, just the dirt road and the scrubland beyond, but he'd learned to appreciate its constancy. The land didn't change much, didn't ask for anything, didn't judge. His work these days was irregular. Once he'd been a full-time hand at the Mercer Ranch, the biggest spread in the county, tending cattle and fixing fence and doing the 1,000 small tasks that kept a ranch running. But age had a way of making you expendable. His knees ached in cold weather, his grip wasn't as strong as it used to be, and younger men could work longer hours for less complaint. 5 years ago, old man Mercer had let him go, kindly, with an apology and a handshake, and since then Silas had cobbled together work where he could find it. A few days here hauling hay, a week there helping with a roundup. Odd jobs that paid cash and kept him from having to dip too deep into the small pension he'd managed to squirrel away. He didn't talk much about being lonely. Loneliness wasn't something you admitted to in a place like Prospect Ridge, where self-sufficiency was a virtue and needing people was seen as weakness. But the truth was, most days passed without him speaking more than a handful of words to another soul. He'd nod to folks at the post office or the general store, exchange pleasantries about the weather or the price of feed. But real conversation, the kind where you shared what was actually on your mind, that had become rare as summer rain. There had been a woman once, years back, Martha Hensley, a widow who ran the diner on Main Street. She had warm eyes and a laugh that could fill a room, and for a while Silas had thought maybe his life might take a different turn. They dated for nearly a year. Dinners at her place, drives out to the lake, quiet evenings where they'd talk about their pasts without too much pain. But Martha had children, grown children who lived in Portland and Seattle, and when they started pressuring her to sell the diner and move closer to them, she'd gone. She'd asked Silas to come with her, to start fresh somewhere new. But the thought of leaving the only place he'd known for decades, of trying to fit into a city where he'd be even more out of place, he couldn't do it. They'd parted kindly, promising to stay in touch, but the letters had dwindled and eventually stopped. That had been 7 years ago, and he hadn't tried again. The town itself had a way of making loneliness communal without anyone acknowledging it. There was Floyd Barnett, who ran the hardware store and hadn't spoken to his brother in 12 years over some slight no one could quite remember. There was Pauline Morris, the elementary school teacher, who'd never married and lived with her elderly mother in the same house she'd grown up in. There was Bud Carmichael, the part-time deputy, whose wife had left him for a salesman from Boise and who now spent his evenings at the Lucky Strike Tavern, nursing beers and watching sports he didn't care about. These were good people, decent people, but they were all locked in their own separate struggles, their own quiet disappointments, and nobody quite knew how to reach across the distance. Silas's routine rarely varied. Morning coffee, whatever work he could find, an evening meal of something simple, beans and cornbread, a can of stew, sometimes eggs if he felt ambitious. He'd watch the news, though it mostly depressed him, all the anger and chaos of a world that seemed to be spinning faster than he could follow. Then he'd turn to the Western Channel and watch men on horses solving problems with clear codes of right and wrong. And he'd wonder when life had gotten so complicated that even knowing what was decent had become a matter of debate. On Sundays, he'd drive out to the Mercer Ranch, not for work, but just to check on the horses. Old man Mercer had passed 2 years back, and his son Tom ran the place now, though without much of his father's touch. Tom didn't mind Silas coming by. He barely noticed, truth be told, and Silas would spend a few hours in the barn, brushing down the horses, talking to them in the low, gentle voice that animals responded to. The horses didn't care that he was old or alone or mostly forgotten. They just knew his hands were steady and his presence was calm, and that was enough. It was on one of these Sunday drives that everything changed, though he didn't know it yet. The route to the Mercer Ranch took him past the old Halstead property, 60 acres of scrubland and dried-up pasture that had been sitting empty for the better part of a decade. Byron Halstead had been a donkey breeder, an odd profession in cattle country, but he'd made a decent living, selling them to ranchers who needed pack animals, or to city folks who thought a donkey would be a charming addition to their hobby farm. Then the economy had crashed, and the market had dried up, and Byron had gone bankrupt. The bank had foreclosed. Byron had moved away to live with a daughter in California, and the property had sat there ever since, slowly surrendering to weather and neglect. Silas had driven past it 100 times, barely giving it a glance. The main house had collapsed in on itself years ago, and the fences were down in so many places that they were more suggestion than barrier. But on this particular morning in late October, with the sun just starting to burn through the morning mist, he heard something that made him slow his truck. It was faint at first, easy to miss under the rattle of his engine, but when he rolled down the window, it became unmistakable, the sound of braying, dozens of voices rising and falling in a ragged chorus. He pulled over onto the shoulder, killed the engine, and sat there listening. The sound was coming from the old barn, a massive structure that sat a quarter-mile off the road. Its red paint faded to the color of rust. Silas stared at it, frowning. Nothing should be alive on that property. The bank had cleared it out years ago, taken anything of value and left the rest to rot. But there it was, the unmistakable sound of animals, and not just one or two. It sounded like dozens, maybe more, their voices carrying across the empty land like a call for help that no one had bothered to answer. Silas sat there for a long moment, his hands resting on the steering wheel. He had a dozen reasons to keep driving. It wasn't his property, wasn't his business, and getting involved in other people's problems had a way of creating complications he didn't need. But the sound didn't stop, and the longer he listened, the more it worked its way under his skin. He thought about his father's watch, frozen at 3:47, and about all the times in his life when he'd walked away from things because they seemed too hard or too complicated or just not his concern. He thought about what his father would do, the man who'd worked himself to death trying to save something he loved. Then he put the truck in gear, turned onto the dirt track that led to the Halstead place, and drove toward the barn to see what was making all that noise. The dirt track hadn't been maintained in years, and Silas's truck bounced over ruts and washouts that tried to pull the steering wheel from his hands. Tumbleweed had piled against what remained of the fence line, and the whole property had the hollow, abandoned feeling of a place the world had decided to forget. As he drew closer to the barn, the braying grew louder, more insistent, and he felt something tighten in his chest. The barn itself was enormous, one of those old-style structures built in the 20s when labor was cheap and men still believed in building things to last. The foundation was fieldstone, the walls rough-cut lumber now weathered to silver gray. The roof sagged in places but mostly held, and the big sliding door on the front stood half open, revealing nothing but darkness beyond. Silas parked the truck and climbed out slowly, his knees protesting the movement. The smell hit him immediately, manure and urine and something else, something sour and wrong that spoke of neglect and suffering. He stood there for a moment, one hand on the truck's hood, trying to prepare himself for whatever he was about to find. The braying had stopped when he'd pulled up, replaced by an uneasy silence, broken only by the sound of shuffling hooves and heavy breathing. He walked toward the barn door, his boots crunching on gravel, and as his eyes adjusted to the shadows, he felt his breath catch in his throat. They were everywhere. Donkeys filled the barn from wall to wall, packed so tightly they could barely move. Some stood swaying on unsteady legs. Others lay in the fouled straw, too weak or too sick to rise. Their ribs showed through their dusty coats like the bars of cages, and their eyes, Lord, their eyes, held a mix of desperation and resignation that cut right through him. There must have been 200 of them, maybe more, crammed into a space meant for a third of that number. Silas stood frozen in the doorway, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. Byron Halstead had been gone for years. The bank had supposedly cleared the property, sold off the livestock, tied up all the loose ends. But somehow, impossibly, these animals had been left behind. Or maybe, and his stomach turned at the thought, maybe someone had dumped them here more recently, using the abandoned property as a convenient place to hide a problem they didn't want to deal with. He moved deeper into the barn, stepping carefully over mounds of manure that hadn't been cleaned in what looked like months. The donkeys nearest him shied away, but they didn't have far to go. Some watched him with wary eyes. Others seemed too exhausted to care, their heads hanging low, their breathing labored. In one of the stalls, he found a small grey jenny lying on her side. She didn't lift her head when he approached, didn't react when he knelt beside her. Her breathing was shallow, her eyes half closed. Round her neck was a faded leather collar with a metal tag that bore the name Clementine, stamped in crude letters. His hands shook as he reached out to touch her, feeling the heat of fever radiating through her coat. "Easy, girl," he murmured, though he doubted she could hear him. "Easy now." He stayed with her for a few moments, one hand resting gently on her shoulder before forcing himself to stand and continue his survey. The deeper he went into the barn, the worse it got. There was no food, no clean water. The few troughs that remained were either empty or filled with stagnant algae-covered liquid that nothing should be expected to drink. Some of the donkeys had injuries, cuts that had become infected, abscesses on their legs, hooves so overgrown they curled up like elf shoes. It was systematic neglect on a scale he'd never witnessed, and the fact that it had happened in plain sight just off a county road made it somehow worse. He found his way back outside, needing air, needing space. His hands were shaking, and he realized with some surprise that he was crying. Not sobbing, just a steady leak of tears that he couldn't seem to stop. He'd seen animals suffer before. Ranch life wasn't kind, and death was part of the cycle whether you liked it or not. But this was different. This wasn't nature taking its course. This was abandonment, pure and simple. Someone had looked at these animals and decided they weren't worth the trouble of caring for. He pulled out his phone and stared at it, trying to decide what to do. The logical thing would be to call animal control, report what he'd found, let the authorities handle it. But something stopped him. He knew how these things worked. The county didn't have resources for this kind of situation. At best, they'd round up the donkeys and put most of them down. It would be cheaper than trying to rehab and rehome 200 neglected animals. At worst, they'd argue about jurisdiction and funding while the donkeys continued to suffer. He thought about the Jenny lying in the stall, wearing a collar with a name stamped into it. Someone had cared enough to name her once. Someone had thought she mattered enough to deserve an identity beyond just being livestock. And now she was dying in her own filth while the world drove past, too busy with its own concerns to notice. Silas looked at the barn, then at his truck, then back at the barn. What he was thinking was crazy. He was 65 years old, living on a pension that barely covered his own needs. He didn't have land, didn't have equipment, didn't have help. He had no business taking on a project like this. Any reasonable person would make the call, file the report, and walk away knowing they'd done what they could. But standing there in the October morning, with the sun climbing higher and the sound of suffering animals still echoing in his ears, Silas Greer found that he wasn't interested in being reasonable. He'd spent most of his life being practical, being sensible, taking care of himself, and not sticking his neck out for causes that weren't his concern. And what did he have to show for it? An empty trailer, a string of lonely years, and the slow certainty that his life hadn't meant much beyond the labor of his own survival. He looked down at his hands, weathered and scarred from decades of ranch work. They were still strong enough to hold a hammer, to haul a bucket, to steady a frightened animal. Maybe that was enough. Maybe that was all that mattered. He pulled open the truck door, grabbed the 2 plastic water jugs he kept behind the seat, and started back toward the barn. He didn't have a plan, not really. He didn't know how he was going to feed 200 donkeys, or where he'd get the supplies, or what he'd do when winter came and they needed shelter that wasn't falling apart. All he knew was that he couldn't leave them there to die. As he filled the first trough with water and watched the donkeys surge forward to drink, pushing and jostling in their desperation, he felt something shift inside him. It wasn't hope exactly. He was too old and too tired for that kind of optimism. But it was something. A sense of purpose, maybe. A reason to get up in the morning that went beyond just making it through another day. He worked until the water jugs were empty, then drove to the general store and bought 6 bales of hay with money he couldn't really afford to spend. He drove back to the barn and started distributing it, breaking the bales into sections and scattering them where the weakest animals could reach. The donkeys ate like they were starving, which they were, and he had to ration it carefully to keep them from making themselves sick. When the sun was high overhead and his back was screaming at him to stop, he finally allowed himself to rest. He sat on the tailgate of his truck, looking at the barn, at the sea of faces watching him from the darkness. Clementine's collar hung from his belt loop now, a reminder of what he was fighting for and what he stood to lose if he failed. He'd tell people tomorrow. He'd figure out the logistics, make the calls, find the help. But for today, this was enough. He'd found them, and he'd come back, and that was more than anyone else had done. That was a start. The next morning, Silas woke before dawn, with his entire body aching in ways he'd almost forgotten. His lower back was locked up tight, his shoulders burned, and his hands were so stiff he could barely work them open. He sat on the edge of his bed for a long moment, staring at the floor, wondering what the hell he'd gotten himself into. But then he thought about those faces in the barn, about Clementine lying in the straw, and he forced himself to stand. He made coffee and sat at the kitchen table with an old ranch ledger he'd found in a drawer, a relic from his days at the Mercer Ranch. Pages yellowed with age and filled with notations about cattle births and feed costs. He opened it to a blank page and started making a list, trying to impose some order on the chaos. Water, food, medical care, shelter repairs, long-term plan. Each item seemed impossible on its own, and together they formed a mountain too steep for one man to climb. But he'd learned long ago that the only way to tackle something overwhelming was to break it down into pieces small enough to manage. So he wrote Day 1, water and hay. Day 2, veterinary assessment. Day 3, contact county about property rights. He'd need help, he knew that. But asking for help meant explaining what he was doing, and he wasn't sure he could explain it even to himself. How do you tell people you're taking on the care of 200 abandoned animals when you can barely take care of yourself? How do you justify spending money you don't have on creatures that aren't yours and probably never will be? Still, he had to try. His first call was to Doc Hastings, the large animal veterinarian who served the ranches in a 3-county area. Silas had known him for 20 years, trusted him as much as he trusted anyone. And if there was one person who might understand, it would be Doc. Silas, Doc answered on the 3rd ring, his voice gravelly with sleep. It's 6 in the morning. Somebody die? Not yet, Silas said, but they might if I don't get help. You got time to make a call today? He explained the situation in short, blunt sentences. The barn, the donkeys, the condition they were in. Doc was quiet for a long moment after he finished. 200, you said. Give or take, Lord have mercy. Doc exhaled slowly. That's going to be expensive, Silas. Even just doing triage, looking at the worst cases, I'm talking thousands of dollars. You got that kind of money? No, Silas admitted, but I can't just leave them. Another pause. I'll come out this afternoon, Doc said finally. No promises beyond looking, but I'll come look. The second call was harder. He dialed the county extension office and got put through to a woman named Patricia who handled animal welfare complaints. He tried to explain what he'd found, but she kept interrupting him with questions he couldn't answer. Who owned the property? Had he filed a formal report? Was he aware that caring for abandoned livestock without proper authorization could open him up to liability? Ma'am, he said, trying to keep the frustration out of his voice, I'm not trying to cause problems. I just found animals that are dying and I'm trying to help. I understand that, Mr. Greer, but we have procedures. How long do your procedures take? Well, there's an investigation period, and we'd need to contact the property owner, and then there's the question of funding. So, weeks. Months, it depends on... These animals don't have weeks, Silas said. They might not have days, Patricia sighed. I'll put in a report. That's all I can do right now. In the meantime, I'd advise you not to interfere with what might be evidence of animal cruelty. He hung up, feeling more alone than when he'd started. By 10 o'clock, he was back at the barn with more hay and a plan to start clearing out the worst of the filth. He'd brought a shovel, a pitchfork, and a wheelbarrow from his trailer, and he set to work mucking out the stalls. It was brutal labor, made worse by the fact that the donkeys couldn't be moved. There was nowhere to move them to. So he worked around them, trying to create small islands of clean space where the weakest ones could lie down without being in their own waste. The Jenny he'd found yesterday, Clementine, was still alive, but barely. He'd brought a bucket of fresh water and held it near her muzzle, trying to get her to drink. She managed a few laps before her head drooped back to the ground. "Come on, girl," he murmured. "Just a little more. You can do it." But she couldn't or wouldn't, and after a while he had to move on to the others. By noon, he'd cleared 2 stalls and was working on a third when he heard a vehicle pull up outside. He straightened, wiping sweat from his forehead, and saw Doc Hastings climbing out of his truck with his medical bag. Doc was in his early 70s, a tall man gone soft around the middle, with white hair and the kind of face that had seen just about everything and stopped being surprised by any of it. He stood at the barn entrance for a moment, taking in the scene, and Silas saw his jaw tighten. Jesus, Silas. Yeah. Doc moved into the barn slowly, his eyes scanning the animals. He knelt beside a few, checking their eyes and teeth, running his hands over their bodies, making soft, clicking sounds with his tongue. After about 20 minutes, he came back to where Silas was standing. "You know what you're looking at here?" Doc asked. "A disaster. That's putting it mildly." Doc set his bag down and rubbed the back of his neck. "I count at least 30 that need immediate medical intervention. Another 50 that are severely malnourished but might recover with proper care. The rest," he gestured at the crowd of donkeys watching them, "the rest are in rough shape, but probably salvageable if you can get food and water into them consistently." "What about her?" Silas pointed to Clementine. Doc walked over and knelt beside the Jenny. His examination was gentle but thorough, and when he stood up, he was shaking his head. "She's past helping, Silas. Pneumonia, probably other infections. Most humane thing would be to put her down." "No, Silas, I said no." The words came out harder than he'd intended. "I know what you're saying makes sense, but I can't. I'm not starting this by giving up on the first one." Doc looked at him for a long moment. "You can't save them all. You know that, right?" "I know. But I have to try with her. Please." Doc sighed and pulled a bottle of antibiotics from his bag. "This might buy her a few days. That's all I'm promising. And you need to be realistic about what's possible here." "I will be," Silas said, though they both knew it was a lie. After Doc left, Silas sat with Clementine and administered the medicine. The Jenny's breathing was shallow, labored, but she was still fighting. He stayed there as the afternoon light slanted through the gaps in the barn walls, his hand resting on her shoulder, and wrote in his ledger, "Day 2, help arriving, 1 chance at a time." By the end of the first week, Silas had established a routine that was slowly killing him. Up at 4, drive to the barn by 5, work until dark, drive home, collapse into bed and do it all again. He'd burned through most of his savings on hay and basic supplies, and his body was a catalogue of pain, blisters that wouldn't heal, muscles that screamed every time he moved, a persistent cough from breathing in dust and dander all day. But Clementine was still alive. Against all odds, against Doc Hastings' predictions, the little grey Jenny had hung on. She wasn't thriving, she could barely stand, but she was fighting, and that gave Silas something to hold on to when everything else felt impossible. Word had gotten around town the way it always did. Floyd Barnett had seen him loading hay at the feed store 3 days in a row and asked what he was up to. Silas had tried to keep it vague, but Floyd was persistent, and eventually the whole story came out. By that evening, half of Prospect Ridge knew that old Silas Greer had taken it upon himself to care for a barn full of abandoned donkeys. The reactions were mixed. Some folks thought it was admirable, if a bit foolish. Pauline Morris, the school teacher, stopped by his trailer one evening with a casserole and words of encouragement. "It's good," she said, handing him the dish. "What you're doing. We need more people willing to care." Others thought he'd lost his mind. But Carmichael, the deputy, cornered him outside the post office and asked if he was aware that what he was doing might technically be trespassing since he didn't own the property. "I'm not saying I'd arrest you," Bud clarified, "but the bank might have opinions, and then there were people like Dale Griffin, who ran the Lucky Strike Tavern and seemed to take personal offense at the whole situation. Dale was a hard man who'd inherited the bar from his father, and seemed to resent anyone who suggested that life required anything more than working hard and keeping your head down. Waste of time," he said loudly one afternoon when Silas came in to use the payphone. "Those animals are doomed anyway." "You're just throwing good money after bad," Silas didn't argue. He'd learned long ago that you couldn't change minds that were already made up, so he just nodded and made his call and left. But Dale's words stuck with him, mainly because there was truth in them. He was throwing money after bad. He'd spent nearly $3,000 in a week, money he couldn't afford, and he'd barely made a dent in the problem. The barn needed major repairs. The donkeys needed ongoing medical care. Winter was coming, and he had no idea how he'd keep 200 animals alive when the temperature dropped and the snow started falling. He sat in his truck one evening, too exhausted to drive home yet, and pulled out a sheet of paper from his ledger. He'd started drawing a map of the barn, trying to organize the chaos. Section A held the weakest animals. Section B was for those who could stand but needed close monitoring. Section C was for the ones who seemed stable enough to manage with just food and water. Clementine was marked in Section A with a small star. Looking at the map, at all the little marks and notations he'd made, he felt the weight of it settle over him like a physical thing. He was one man trying to do the work of 10, and he was failing. The animals were better off than they'd been a week ago, sure, but better off wasn't good enough. They needed real care, sustained effort, a plan that went beyond him just showing up every day until his body gave out. He was so deep in these thoughts that he didn't hear the vehicle pull up until someone knocked on his window. He looked up to find a woman standing there, maybe in her late 50s, wearing a flannel shirt and jeans. She had short grey hair and a face that suggested she spent a lot of time outdoors. He rolled down the window. "Help you?" "Are you Silas Greer?" "That's right. I'm Ruth Chen. I run the Four Corners Rescue over in Dayville." She gestured at the barn. "Heard you've got a situation here." Silas studied her. "News travels. It does in ranch country." Ruth smiled. "Mind if I take a look?" He hesitated, then nodded. They walked to the barn together, and Ruth moved through it the way Doc Hastings had, quietly assessing, her trained eye picking out details he'd probably missed. After about 15 minutes, she came back to him. "You know you're in over your head," she said. It wasn't a question. "Yeah, you know most of these animals are going to need months of rehabilitation." "Yeah, and you know you can't do this alone." He met her eyes. "I'm figuring that out," Ruth nodded slowly. "Okay, here's what I can offer. My rescue is small. We've only got space for maybe 20 animals at a time. But I can take your worst cases, the ones that need intensive care, and I've got volunteers who know what they're doing. That'll free you up to focus on the rest." Silas felt something loosen in his chest. "Why would you do that?" "Because it needs doing," Ruth said simply. "And because what you started here matters. You could have walked away and you didn't. That counts for something." They spent the next hour going through the barn, identifying which animals were in the most critical condition. Ruth made notes, took photographs, promised to come back with a trailer in 2 days. As she was leaving, she turned back to him. "You need to think bigger than just surviving day to day," she said. "These animals need a real home, a real plan. You need to make this official, get the community involved, turn it into something sustainable. I don't know how to do that. Neither did I when I started my rescue," Ruth said. "But you figure it out. And you're not alone anymore." After she left, Silas sat with Clementine updating his ledger. The map of the barn now had new notations, 20 animals marked for transfer to Ruth's rescue. It wasn't much, but it was progress. It was the first time since he'd found this place that he felt like maybe, just maybe, this impossible thing might actually be possible. He looked at the little grey Jenny, her breathing slightly easier than it had been yesterday, and allowed himself a moment of hope. "We're going to figure this out," he told her. "One day at a time." Clementine's ear flicked in his direction. It was the first time she'd responded to his voice. Silas smiled and updated his ledger. Day 7. Not alone. The transfer of the 20 sickest donkeys to Ruth's rescue happened on a grey November morning, and Silas felt every one of them leave like a piece of his heart being loaded into a trailer. He knew they'd be better off. Ruth had proper facilities, trained staff, resources he couldn't provide. But watching them go still felt like admitting defeat, like he'd failed somehow in his promise to care for all of them. Clementine was among those who left. She'd improved enough to travel, but Doc Hastings had been clear that she needed ongoing medical care Silas couldn't provide at the barn. Ruth had promised he could visit any time, but as the trailer pulled away, with Clementine inside, Silas felt the loss like a physical ache. With 20 animals gone, the barn felt marginally less crowded, but the work didn't get easier. If anything, it got harder as the reality of winter set in. The first snow came early that year, a light dusting in mid-November that melted by afternoon but served as a warning of what was coming. Silas worked to patch the worst holes in the barn roof, climbing up on a ladder that probably wasn't safe for a man his age, nailing down tarps and scraps of plywood. His hands went numb in the cold, and twice he nearly fell, catching himself at the last second. The expenses were crushing him. He'd blown through his entire savings, maxed out a credit card he'd kept for emergencies, and started borrowing from the small line of credit the bank had given him years ago for his trailer. Every morning, he did the math in his head, trying to figure out how many more weeks he could keep this going before he went completely broke. One evening, sitting in his trailer with bills spread across the kitchen table, he pulled out an old photograph he kept in his wallet. It showed him and his father standing beside a corral. Silas, maybe 20 years old, lean and dark-haired, full of the certainty that comes from not yet understanding how hard life could be. His father stood beside him, one hand on the corral rail, looking at the camera with tired eyes and a slight smile. It had been taken maybe a year before his death, before the bank foreclosed, before everything fell apart. Silas had carried that photograph for 42 years, through failed relationships and lost jobs and lonely nights in cheap motels. He'd carried it like a talisman, a reminder of who he'd been and who he'd wanted to become. But looking at it now, he wondered if he'd been carrying it for the wrong reasons. Maybe it wasn't about living up to his father's legacy. Maybe it was about learning from his mistakes. His father had killed himself trying to save a ranch that was already lost. He'd worked 18-hour days, borrowed money he couldn't repay, refused to accept that sometimes things were beyond saving. And in the end, he died alone in a barn, with nothing to show for it but debt and exhaustion. Was that what Silas was doing now? Killing himself for animals he couldn't save, throwing away what little he had left on a cause that was doomed from the start? He put the photograph on the table and stared at it. His father looked back at him across the decades, offering no answers. Just that tired smile and those tired eyes. The next morning, he brought the photograph to the barn and tucked it into a corner of one of the stalls, propped against a post where he could see it while he worked. It felt right somehow, having his father there, bearing witness to what he was trying to do. Ruth came by later that week with updates on the animals at her rescue. Most were responding well to treatment. Clementine was eating regularly now, gaining weight, showing more energy. But 3 hadn't made it, too far gone, their systems too compromised. Ruth delivered the news gently, but Silas felt each loss like a punch. "You can't blame yourself," Ruth said. "You gave them a chance they wouldn't have had otherwise." "Doesn't feel like enough." "It never does." She handed him a folder of papers. "I've been making some calls. There's a non-profit over in Portland that helps fund animal rescues. They might be willing to help if we can show we've got a viable plan." Silas looked at the papers, grant applications, donation forms, legal documents establishing a formal rescue organization. "I don't know anything about running a non-profit. Neither did I when I started." "You learn." Ruth sat down on a hay bale. "But here's the thing, Silas. You need to decide what you're really doing here. Are you just trying to keep these animals alive until someone else takes the problem off your hands? Or are you trying to build something lasting?" "I don't know," he admitted. "I just know I can't walk away. That's a start. But it's not enough." Ruth leaned forward, her hands clasped between her knees. "You've got people in this town who are watching what you're doing. Some think you're crazy, sure, but others see something worth supporting. Pauline Morris called me yesterday asking how she could help. So did a couple of ranchers from the valley. You're not alone in this, but you need to give people something to rally around. Right now, you're just the old guy with the donkeys. You need to become more than that. After Ruth left, Silas sat in the barn and tried to imagine what she was describing. A real rescue operation, with volunteers and funding and a mission statement. It seemed impossibly far from where he was, one exhausted man, barely keeping his head above water. But then he looked around at the donkeys, at the animals who were noticeably healthier than they'd been a month ago, and he thought maybe Ruth was right. Maybe survival wasn't enough. Maybe he needed to aim higher. That evening, he started filling out the grant application. It asked questions he didn't know how to answer, about organizational structure and long-term goals and community impact. But he did his best, writing in his careful, blocky handwriting about why these animals mattered, about second chances and dignity and the responsibility to care for things that couldn't care for themselves. When he was done, he tucked the application into his ledger and looked at the photograph of his father. "I hope I'm doing this right," he said to the empty trailer. "I hope this isn't just me being stubborn." The photograph didn't answer, but somehow that was okay. His father had made his choices, and Silas was making his. They didn't have to be the same choices to honor the same values. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows of the trailer. Winter was coming in earnest now, and Silas knew the hardest part was still ahead. But for the first time since he'd found the barn, he felt like maybe he wasn't just reacting to a crisis. Maybe he was building something. Maybe that was enough. December came with a vengeance. The temperature dropped below freezing and stayed there, and the snow that had been threatening finally arrived in earnest. Silas found himself working in conditions that would have seemed impossible a few months ago, hauling frozen water buckets, breaking ice from troughs 3 times a day, trying to keep the barn warm enough that the weakest animals wouldn't freeze. The propane heaters he'd bought had eaten through another $500 he didn't have, and still the barn was barely above freezing. He'd started sleeping there some nights, curled up in the cab of his truck with the engine running periodically to keep warm, because the thought of leaving the animals alone in the bitter cold was worse than his own discomfort. It was on one of these nights that Pauline Morris showed up with a group of her students. Silas was mucking out a stall when he heard voices outside, and he walked out to find Pauline's van parked next to his truck and 8 kids climbing out. Ranging in age from maybe 10 to 15, "We came to help," Pauline said simply. Silas looked at the kids, then at Pauline. "It's too cold. They're ranch kids," Pauline interrupted. "They've worked in worse, and they've been asking about the donkeys ever since I told them what you were doing." The kids were already moving toward the barn, their breath misting in the cold air. Silas wanted to argue, wanted to send them home where it was warm and safe, but the truth was he needed help desperately, and these kids were offering what he couldn't afford to refuse. They worked for 3 hours. The kids hauled hay, filled water buckets, swept out stalls. They worked with the easy competence of children raised around animals, and they asked questions constantly. What were the donkeys' names? Where did they come from? Could they pet this one? Was that one friendly? Silas found himself talking more than he had in weeks, explaining what he knew and making up stories for the things he didn't. One girl, maybe 12, with red hair in braids, spent most of her time with an old Jack who'd been particularly skittish. She sat on a hay bale and talked to him in a soft, steady voice until he finally approached and let her touch his nose. When it was time to leave, she looked up at Silas with serious eyes. "Can I come back?" "If your mom says it's okay," Silas said, glancing at Pauline. "She can come back," Pauline confirmed. "They all can if you'll have them." After they left, Silas found something hanging on the barn door, a hand-painted wooden sign that said Second Chances Ranch in bright blue letters, with small paintings of donkeys around the border. Pauline must have had the kids make it, probably spent class time on it, and the thought made his throat tight. He hung the sign on the barn door, securing it with wire, and stood back to look at it. Second Chances Ranch. He'd mentioned that name to Ruth weeks ago, just an offhand comment about what the place represented, but seeing it written out like that made it feel real, made it feel like maybe this wasn't just him fighting a losing battle. Maybe it was actually becoming something, but that night, alone in his trailer, the doubt came creeping back. He'd submitted the grant application, but he hadn't heard anything. His credit card was maxed out. The bank had started sending letters about his line of credit. He was getting behind on his trailer payment, and winter wasn't even half over yet. He pulled out his ledger and did the math again, trying to find some combination of numbers that would work, some way to make it all add up. But the numbers didn't lie. He had maybe 3 weeks before he ran completely out of money, and then what? The animals would starve. All the work he'd done, all the progress they'd made would be for nothing. He was so deep in these dark thoughts that he almost didn't hear the knock on his door. When he opened it, he found Floyd Barnett standing there, stamping his feet against the cold. "Floyd, it's late." "I know." Floyd looked uncomfortable. "Can I come in?" Silas stepped aside, and Floyd entered, filling the small space with his bulk. He stood there for a moment, looking around the trailer, before pulling an envelope from his coat pocket. "This was in my store today," Floyd said, handing it over. "Dale Griffin was mouthing off about you, about how you're wasting your time with those animals. Got me thinking." Silas opened the envelope. Inside was $1,100 in cash. "Floyd, I can't—" "Just listen," Floyd interrupted. "I talked to some folks. Turns out there's a lot of people in this town who think what you're doing matters. We took up a collection. It's not enough to solve everything, but it might buy you some time." Silas stared at the money, unable to speak. "There's something else," Floyd continued. "You know the old Henderson place about 5 miles south of here? Been empty since old man Henderson died. His daughter lives in Seattle, doesn't know what to do with it. I talked to her, and she said if you can figure out a way to take care of it, she'd let you use the property. It's got a barn, fenced pastures, even a small house. Why would she do that?" Floyd shrugged. "Said her father would have liked knowing the place was being used for something good, and she liked the idea of it becoming a rescue." He paused. "Dale's not the only one talking about you, Silas. Some folks think you're crazy, sure. But others see what you're doing, and it reminds them that there's still good in the world. You've given people something to believe in." After Floyd left, Silas sat at his kitchen table with the envelope of money in front of him and cried. Not sad tears, he was too tired for sadness. These were tears of relief and gratitude, and the overwhelming realization that he wasn't alone after all. The town he'd never quite felt part of had seen what he was trying to do and decided it mattered. He updated his ledger, noting the donation and the possibility of the Henderson property. Then he looked at the photograph of his father, still sitting where he'd left it on the table. "I think we're going to make it," he whispered. "I think we're actually going to make it." Outside, the snow continued to fall, but inside the trailer, for the first time in weeks, Silas felt warm. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in mid-December, delivered by certified mail that required Silas's signature. He stood in his trailer, holding the envelope with a return address from Morrison and Associates, attorneys at law, and felt his stomach drop. Nothing good ever came in certified mail. He made coffee before opening it, needing the ritual of familiar motions to steady himself. Then he sat down, slid his finger under the flap, and pulled out 3 pages of legal language that took him 2 readings to understand. The Halstead property, it turned out, wasn't abandoned at all. It had been purchased 18 months ago by a development company called Sunrise Holdings, LLC. The animals, the 200-plus donkeys that Silas had found, weren't abandoned either. According to the letter, they were part of an ongoing legal dispute between Sunrise Holdings and Byron Halstead over what constituted existing livestock in the property sale. The donkeys had been left on the property deliberately, not out of cruelty, but as leverage in a lawsuit. And now Sunrise Holdings was demanding that Silas cease all activity on their property immediately, remove any animals he'd relocated, and pay for damages caused by his unauthorized occupation of the premises. The amount they were claiming was $47,000. Silas read the letter 3 times, each pass making him feel sicker. Everything he'd done for the past 2 months, the money he'd spent, the community he'd built, the hope he'd dared to feel, all of it had been based on a misunderstanding. He'd assumed the animals were abandoned, that no one wanted them, that he was saving lives that would otherwise be lost. But according to this letter, he'd been trespassing on private property and interfering with legal proceedings. He grabbed his keys and drove straight to the county courthouse, where he found Patricia from the Animal Welfare Office. She read the letter, her face growing more concerned with each paragraph. "Did you know about this?" Silas asked. "Not the details," Patricia admitted. "I knew there was a property dispute, but I thought it had been settled. And I certainly didn't know about the animals being part of it. So what do I do?" Patricia was quiet for a moment. "Honestly, you need a lawyer. This is beyond animal welfare now. This is property law, civil liability, corporate litigation. It's complicated." "I don't have money for a lawyer," Silas said. "I barely have money for next week's hay." "Then you need to stop," Patricia said gently. "I know that's not what you want to hear, but if you keep going, you could lose everything. They could sue you for more than you'll ever have." Silas drove to Ruth's rescue next, needing to talk to someone who understood what was at stake. Ruth listened to the whole story, read the letter, and sat back in her chair with a heavy sigh. "Did you know Clementine died?" she asked suddenly. The question hit Silas like a physical blow. "What? 2 days ago? She seemed to be improving, but then her lungs just gave out. Doc Hastings said she'd been sick too long. The damage was too extensive." Ruth's eyes were kind but sad. "I was going to call you, but I wanted to tell you in person." Silas felt the trailer around him seem to tilt. Clementine, the little grey Jenny who'd been fighting so hard, who'd become his reason for starting this whole thing, was gone. And he hadn't been there. He'd sent her away to get better care, and she died anyway, probably alone, probably scared. "I'm sorry," Ruth said. "I know she meant something to you. She was the first one I tried to save," Silas said, his voice rough. "I told her we'd figure it out." They sat in silence for a while. Finally, Ruth spoke again. "About this letter. I have a friend who's a lawyer, does some pro bono work for animal rescues. Let me make a call, see what she says. There might be options you're not seeing." But driving back to the barn, Silas felt like he could see everything too clearly. He'd been fooling himself, playing at being a rescuer when he was really just an old man who didn't know when to quit. The town's donations wouldn't matter if he got sued for $47,000. The Henderson property wouldn't matter if he was legally barred from operating a rescue. And all the animals he'd managed to help wouldn't matter if the rest had to go back to being pawns in some corporate lawsuit. He pulled up to the barn and sat in his truck, looking at the hand-painted sign Pauline's students had made. Second Chances Ranch. The words that had seemed so full of promise now felt like a cruel joke. Second chances were for people who got things right the first time around, not for fools who charged into situations they didn't understand. He was still sitting there when another vehicle pulled up, a sleek SUV that looked out of place on the dirt road. A man in a business suit climbed out, picking his way carefully across the muddy ground. "Mr. Greer, I'm Richard Morrison, the attorney who sent you that letter. I was hoping we could talk." Silas climbed out of his truck slowly. "Not much to talk about. I don't have $47,000. "I know," Morrison said. "I've done my research. You've spent everything you have on these animals, maxed out your credit, borrowed against your home. You're financially tapped out." He paused. "That's actually why I'm here, to threaten me some more, to make you an offer." Morrison pulled out a folder from his briefcase. "My client, Sunrise Holdings, has been following what you've done here. The community response, the media attention, the way people have rallied around this place. They think there's an opportunity." "What kind of opportunity?" "They want to donate the property to your rescue," Morrison said. "The barn, the 60 acres, all of it. In exchange, you agree not to oppose their development plans for the adjacent parcels, and you release them from any liability related to the animals." Silas stared at him. "Why would they do that?" "Because right now, they look like the bad guys, the corporation that left animals to die while they fought in court. But if they donate the property to a local rescue, if they become the heroes who made this possible," Morrison smiled, "that's good publicity. That's the kind of story that makes people forget about the lawsuit and remember the redemption. And the donkeys? Keep them, move them, do whatever you want with them. They'd become your responsibility entirely. My client just wants this resolved quietly and positively. Silas looked at the barn, at the faces watching him from the shadows. I need to think about it. You have 48 hours, Morrison said. After that, the offer expires, and we proceed with litigation. After the lawyer left, Silas walked into the barn and stood among the animals. They pressed close to him, these creatures he'd spent 2 months caring for, and he felt the weight of the choice he had to make. Accept the offer, and he'd get everything he'd been working toward. The property, the chance to build something real, a future for these animals. But he'd also be letting a corporation buy its way out of responsibility, turning suffering into a PR opportunity. He stayed there until dark, surrounded by donkeys, trying to figure out what his father would do. Trying to figure out what was right, when all the choices felt complicated and none of them felt clean. Silas didn't sleep that night. He sat at his kitchen table with the lawyer's offer in front of him, along with his ledger, the photograph of his father, and Clementine's collar that he'd retrieved from Ruth's rescue. The numbers told one story. Accept the deal and get the property, refuse it and lose everything. But numbers didn't tell the whole story. And Silas had learned enough in 65 years to know that the right choice wasn't always the one that made the most sense on paper. By morning, he'd made a decision, but he needed to talk it through with people he trusted. He called Ruth first, explaining the offer and his reservations. They're using the donkeys to clean up their image, Silas said. It feels wrong to let them get away with that. Maybe, Ruth said. But those animals need a home, and this gives them one. Sometimes you have to hold your nose and take the help you can get, even if it comes from people whose motives aren't pure. His second call was to Pauline Morris. She listened carefully, asked questions, and then said something that surprised him. You should call a town meeting, she said. This isn't just your decision anymore, Silas. You've made this whole town part of what you're building. They deserve a say. I don't know how to do that. I do. I'll make the calls, get the word out. We'll meet at the community center tomorrow night. Can you wait that long before responding to the lawyer? Silas called Morrison and negotiated an extension. The lawyer agreed, probably smelling that a yes was coming eventually. The next evening, Silas walked into the Prospect Ridge Community Center and found it more crowded than he'd ever seen it. Every folding chair was occupied, and people lined the walls. Ranchers and shopkeepers, families with kids, elderly folks he recognized from Sunday church services. Pauline stood at the front with a handwritten agenda taped to the wall, and she gestured for Silas to join her. Thank you all for coming, Pauline began. I know it's short notice, but we've got an important decision to make about Second Chance's ranch and the future of those donkeys. Silas is going to explain the situation, and then we'll discuss what this town wants to do about it. Silas stood up, feeling every eye in the room on him. Public speaking had never been his strength. He was better with animals than people, better with silence than words. But he owed these folks the truth, so he laid it out as simply as he could. The legal situation, the corporation's offer, the choice between accepting help from a company that had left animals to suffer or refusing it, and watching everything fall apart. When he finished, the room erupted into conversation. People had opinions, and they weren't shy about sharing them. Dale Griffin stood up first, predictably. This is ridiculous, he said. We're sitting here debating the ethics of a business deal while Silas goes broke, trying to save animals that aren't even his. Take the deal, get the property, move on. It's not complicated. It is complicated, Floyd Barnett countered. If we let this corporation buy their way out of responsibility, we're saying that money can fix anything, that you can neglect animals as long as you write a check later. They're donkeys, Dale shot back, not people. You all are treating this like it's some great moral crusade when it's just an old man who's in over his head. The young girl with red braids, Silas had learned her name was Emma, stood up from where she'd been sitting with her mother. Mr. Griffin, you don't understand. Those donkeys were dying. Me and my friends, we've been going to help Mr. Greer every week, and we've seen what he's done. He's saved their lives. That matters. Sit down, Emma, Dale said. Adults are talking. Let her speak, Pauline said firmly. She's been doing the work. She's earned a voice. Emma stayed standing. My grandpa died last year. Before he died, he told me that the measure of a person isn't what they do when people are watching, but what they do when they think nobody cares. Mr. Greer started helping those donkeys when nobody was watching. Now everybody's watching, and we get to decide what kind of town we want to be. Do we want to be the kind of town that lets corporations do whatever they want as long as they donate money later? Or do we want to be the kind of town that says some things matter more than convenience? The room went quiet. Emma sat down, her face flushed, and her mother squeezed her shoulder proudly. Bud Carmichael, the deputy, stood up next. I've been doing some research, he said. Talked to a friend who works for the State Attorney General's office. Turns out what Sunrise Holdings did, leaving those animals in those conditions, even as part of a legal strategy, that might actually be criminal negligence. If someone filed a complaint, the state might investigate. At minimum, they'd have to answer some uncomfortable questions. Are you suggesting we threaten them? Someone asked. I'm suggesting we have leverage, Bud said. Maybe more than they want us to know about. Ruth Chen, sitting in the back, raised her hand. I've been running an animal rescue for 15 years. I've seen a lot of corporations make promises about donating property or funding. 9 times out of 10, those promises evaporate once the publicity does. If we accept this deal, we need ironclad guarantees, legal documents, deed transfers, everything in writing. And we need the town to be ready to hold them accountable if they don't follow through. The discussion went on for another hour. Voices rising and falling, opinions clashing and converging. Silas sat and listened, amazed at how many people cared, how much thought they were putting into something that had started as just him and a barn full of neglected animals. Finally, Pauline called for a vote. Show of hands. Who thinks Silas should accept the corporation's offer, with the understanding that we'll demand proper legal guarantees and hold them accountable? Hands went up around the room. Not everyone. Dale Griffin sat with his arms crossed, and a few others looked uncertain, but the majority was clear. And who thinks we should refuse the offer and find another way? A handful of hands, but nowhere near as many. Okay, Pauline said. The town has spoken. Silas, the choice is still yours, but you know where we stand. After the meeting, as people filed out, several came up to Silas to shake his hand or offer words of encouragement. Floyd Barnett pulled him aside and handed him another envelope. Second collection, Floyd said. Figured you'd need it regardless of what you decided. There's about 2,000 in there. Emma and her mother approached next. Mr. Greer, Emma's mother said, I want you to know that what you've done, what you're teaching these kids about caring and responsibility, it matters more than you probably realize. Emma handed him a drawing she'd made. A crayon sketch of the barn with donkeys and a man in a cowboy hat. For you, she said shyly. By the time Silas made it back to his trailer, it was nearly midnight. He sat at his table and pulled out a piece of paper, beginning to draft a response to Morrison. He would accept the deal, but with conditions. He wanted everything in writing. The deed transfer, the liability release, a commitment from Sunrise Holdings to fund the first year of operations. He wanted the town's lawyer to review every document. And he wanted it made clear that this wasn't forgiveness for what they'd done, just acceptance of a practical solution to an impossible situation. As he wrote, he thought about what Emma had said, about measuring a person by what they do when nobody's watching. He'd started this alone in the dark with no audience and no expectation of reward. But somewhere along the way, people had started watching, and they'd decided that what he was doing mattered enough to stand with him. He looked at the photograph of his father, at the young man he'd been standing beside the corral with his whole life ahead of him. His father had fought alone and lost. Silas had found a different way, not fighting alone, but building something together, accepting help even when it came from imperfect sources, letting a community decide what they valued and what they were willing to stand for. I think you'd understand, Silas said to the photograph. I hope you would anyway. He finished the letter as dawn broke, then drove to the barn to start the morning feeding. The donkeys greeted him with their familiar chorus, and he moved among them with the ease of repetition, measuring out hay and checking water levels and scratching the ears of the ones who approached him. He had 48 hours to finalize the deal, to sign the papers that would make this place officially real. But for now, in this moment, it was enough to just be here, doing the work, keeping his promise to creatures who had no voice but the one he'd given them. Second Chances Ranch. The name felt right, felt earned, and whatever happened next, whatever complications lay ahead, he knew he'd made the choice his father would have been proud of. Not the easiest choice, and not the perfect one, but the one that honored the belief that some things were worth fighting for, even when the fight seemed impossible. The signing took place at Morrison's office in the county seat, a sterile conference room with fluorescent lights and a view of the parking lot. Silas sat on one side of the long table, flanked by Ruth Chen and a lawyer named Janet Park, who'd agreed to review the documents pro bono. On the other side sat Morrison, and two executives from Sunrise Holdings, a man and a woman in expensive suits who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else. Janet had spent the past 48 hours going through every line of the agreement, and she'd found problems, loopholes in the liability release, vague language about the deed transfer, clauses that would have allowed Sunrise Holdings to back out if certain conditions weren't met. She'd sent the contract back with 13 pages of revisions, and Morrison's team had pushed back on most of them. The environmental inspection clause is non-negotiable, the female executive said. Her name was Victoria Chen, and she had the clipped tone of someone used to getting her way. If there are contamination issues on the property, we need protection. The inspection already happened, Janet countered. Your own report shows the property is clean. This clause is just a backdoor way to delay or cancel the transfer if you change your mind. That's not strike it, or we walk, Janet said simply. Morrison looked at his clients. The male executive, introduced as James Merritt, leaned back in his chair. Let's take a 5-minute break, he said. The Sunrise Holdings team stepped out, and Silas found himself alone with Ruth and Janet. They're going to accept the changes, Janet said. They need this deal more than they want us to know. How can you tell? Silas asked. Because they showed up in person. If they were willing to let this fall apart, they'd have sent Morrison alone with instructions to lowball us. She smiled slightly. Trust me, I've done this before. When the executives returned, Victoria's expression was tight but controlled. We'll accept most of your revisions, she said, but we need a press release. Something we can put out that shows our commitment to animal welfare and community partnership. You want us to make you look good, Ruth said. We want an accurate representation of what we're doing here, James corrected. We're donating valuable property to a worthy cause. That deserves acknowledgement. Silas spoke for the first time since the meeting started. You left those animals to die. Whether it was strategy or negligence or just not caring enough to check on them, you left them to die. Now you want credit for fixing a problem you created. The room went silent. Victoria's face flushed, but James met Silas's gaze steadily. You're right, James said quietly. We screwed up. The lawsuit became more important than the reality of living creatures suffering on that property. That's on us, and no amount of spinning will change it. He paused. But we're trying to make it right now. Not for good publicity, though yes, that's part of it. But because when you screw up this badly, you don't just walk away. You fix what you can and hope it's enough. It was the first honest thing anyone from Sunrise Holdings had said, and Silas found himself reassessing. These weren't monsters. They were just people who'd made bad choices in service of what they thought were bigger priorities, and now they were trying to find a way back to being decent. The press release can say you donated the property, Silas said. It can say you're supporting the rescue, but it has to also say why. Because the animals were neglected under your watch, and this is you taking responsibility. Victoria looked like she wanted to argue, but James nodded. Fair enough. Morrison, write it up. The final contract was 37 pages. Silas read every word, his finger tracing the lines, making sure he understood what he was agreeing to. The property transfer was clean, 60 acres, including the barn and all structures, deeded to Second Chances Ranch as a 501c3 non-profit that Janet would help him establish. Sunrise Holdings would pay for a full veterinary assessment of all remaining animals and provide an initial operating grant of $50,000. In exchange, Silas would release them from liability and agree not to make public statements blaming them for the animals' condition, beyond what was in the agreed press release. At the bottom of the last page was a line for his signature. Silas held the pen, feeling the weight of what he was about to do. This wasn't just accepting help. This was making it official, transforming what had started as one man's stubborn refusal to walk away into something permanent, something that would outlast him. He thought about Clementine, who hadn't lived to see this moment. He thought about his father, who'd lost his fight, but might have won if he'd been willing to accept help. He thought about Emma and the other kids who'd shown up to work in the cold, about Floyd and his collections, about Pauline organizing the town meeting. He signed his name, Silas Greer, in his careful, blocky handwriting, and slid the document back across the table. "Welcome to the property-owning class," Morrison said dryly. Adding his own signature as witness, Silas didn't feel like he owned anything. But for the first time in months, he felt like maybe he'd done something that mattered. The key ceremony, as Pauline had insisted on calling it, happened on a Saturday morning in late January. The temperature had climbed above freezing for the first time in weeks, and the sun broke through the clouds just as people started arriving at the barn. Silas stood near the entrance, wearing his cleanest shirt and a jacket that Ruth had insisted he buy for the occasion. He felt awkward and exposed, unused to being the center of attention, but Pauline had been firm. "This matters to people," she'd said. "Let them celebrate it." They came in trucks and cars, parking along the dirt road because there wasn't enough space near the barn. Ranchers and shopkeepers, families with children, elderly couples who'd driven from neighboring towns after hearing about the rescue. Someone had brought folding tables and set up coffee and donuts. Someone else had hung a banner that said, "Grand Opening, Second." Chances Ranch with the same cheerful lettering as the sign that still hung on the barn door. Ruth arrived with a trailer full of the animals she'd been caring for, including, impossibly wonderfully, Clementine. The little grey Jenny walked down the ramp slowly but steadily, her coat brushed and shining, her eyes clear and alert. "She's alive," Silas breathed, his voice catching. "I lied," Ruth said simply. "I told you she died because I needed you to focus on the legal fight without worrying about her." She was touch and go for a while, but she pulled through. Stubborn thing wouldn't quit. She handed him the lead rope. "She's yours now. Seems right that she should be here for this." Silas knelt in front of Clementine, his hands shaking as he ran them over her neck, feeling the warmth and solidity of her. The little Jenny pushed her nose against his chest, and he wrapped his arms around her neck and held on, not caring who saw him cry. Floyd Barnett approached with a wooden box about the size of a cigar case. "This is from the town," he said. "Well, from me, technically, but I figured we could make it official." Inside the box, nestled on velvet, were 2 keys. One was old and brass, the original key to the barn that Floyd had somehow tracked down from Byron Halstead's daughter. The other was new and silver, cut fresh that morning to fit the new lock they'd installed on the property gate. "Old and new," Floyd said. Seemed appropriate. Pauline called everyone to attention, and the crowd quieted. She gave a short speech about community and compassion and the power of one person deciding that something mattered enough to fight for. Then she called Silas forward and handed him the keys. "These animals needed someone," Pauline said. "And you were there. This whole town is proud of what you've built here, Silas. We're proud to be part of it." The applause was loud and genuine, and Silas felt his face burn with embarrassment and pleasure. He tried to think of something to say, some words that would capture how he felt, but everything seemed inadequate. He started, then stopped. He looked out at the faces watching him, Emma and her mother, Bud Carmichael, Doc Hastings, who'd driven up from his practice, Janet Park, who'd made this legally possible, and dozens of others he knew by sight, if not by name. I spent most of my life feeling like I didn't quite belong anywhere, Silas said finally. This town was just a place I ended up, not a place I chose. But these past few months, you all chose to stand with me for something that shouldn't have mattered to anyone, but mattered to all of us anyway. You taught me that belonging isn't about where you're born or how long you've lived somewhere. It's about what you're willing to show up for when it counts. He held up the keys. These animals have a home now because you all decided they deserved one. That's not my doing, that's yours. So thank you for caring, for helping, for showing an old man that it's never too late to find your people. After the formalities ended, people toured the barn, meeting the donkeys and hearing their stories. Emma spent an hour with the skittish Jack she'd been working with, and Silas watched as the animal finally let her put a halter on him. "What are you going to name him?" Silas asked. "Hope," Emma said without hesitation. "Because that's what this place is." As the sun climbed higher and the crowd began to thin, Silas walked Clementine to a clean stall he'd prepared specially for her. He hung her collar on a hook beside the door, not because she needed it anymore, but as a reminder of where she'd been and how far she'd come. "Welcome home," he told her, scratching behind her ears. "Welcome home." Clementine lowered her head to the fresh hay and began to eat, and Silas stood there watching her, feeling something settle in his chest that had been restless for longer than he could remember. This was what peace felt like, he thought. This was what purpose looked like. And it had been here all along, waiting for him to be brave enough to reach for it. 3 months later, Silas stood at the fence line of the Henderson property, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of amber and rose. The property had been officially transferred, and he'd spent the past weeks moving the healthiest donkeys to their new home, spreading them across 20 acres of pasture that looked like paradise. After the cramped barn where he'd found them, the old barn on the Halstead property still housed about 80 animals who needed more intensive care. But it was manageable now with the team of volunteers who showed up every weekend. Emma came most Saturdays with her friends, and they'd established a routine: morning feeding, mucking stalls, afternoon grooming sessions where the kids would sit with the donkeys and talk about their lives while the animals listened with patient, understanding eyes. Doc Hastings had taken on the rescue as a regular client, visiting twice a month to check on the animals and providing care at a reduced rate. Ruth had connected Silas with a network of other rescues, and they'd already found homes for 30 of the donkeys, good homes with people who understood what these animals had been through and were committed to giving them the care they deserved. The non-profit paperwork had gone through, making Second Chances Ranch official. Janet Park served as the board president, with Ruth, Floyd, and Pauline rounding out the leadership. They'd started fundraising in earnest, and the response had been overwhelming. The local newspaper had run a feature story. A television station from Portland had driven out to film a segment. Donations came in from across the state, small checks from people who'd been moved by the story of one man who couldn't walk away and a town that had decided to stand with him. Silas had moved into the small house on the Henderson property, leaving his trailer behind like an old skin he'd outgrown. The house wasn't much. 2 bedrooms, a kitchen with ancient appliances, a living room with a stone fireplace that actually worked. But it had windows that looked out on the pastures, and in the mornings he could drink his coffee while watching the donkeys graze in the early light. He still kept the photograph of his father, still carried it with him, but he'd added new pictures to the wall: Emma with Hope, Ruth with Clementine, the crowd at the key ceremony, a sunset over the pastures. His life had become richer, fuller, populated with people and purpose in ways he'd stopped believing were possible. This evening, he'd come out to the fence because it was the anniversary of the day he'd first heard the braying from the barn. 1 year since everything changed. He'd brought his ledger with him, the pages now filled with entries that tracked a journey from desperation to hope, to something like redemption. He opened to the first page, where he'd written in those early days, Day 1, water and hay. The handwriting was shaky, uncertain, the words of a man who didn't know if he could do what needed doing. He flipped through the months, watching his entries change. Day 7, not alone. Day 30, maybe we're going to make it. Day 64, the town voted yes. Day 98, signed the papers, and then on a fresh page, he wrote, Day 365, we made it. Thought I'd find you out here. He turned to see Pauline walking toward him, picking her way carefully across the uneven ground. She'd become a regular visitor, often bringing food or news from town, or just company on evenings when the work was done and the quiet felt too big. Just thinking, Silas said. Dangerous habit at our age. Pauline leaned against the fence beside him. Emma wanted me to tell you that Hope let her ride him today. Just bareback around the small corral, but still, she's over the moon. That's good. He's come a long way. So have you. Silas glanced at her. I'm still the same person I was a year ago. No, Pauline said gently. You're really not. A year ago, you were alone and convinced that was all you deserved. Now look at you, running a rescue, leading a team, giving kids like Emma something to believe in. You've become someone people look up to, Silas, whether you like it or not. I just did what needed doing. That's exactly what makes it matter. Pauline touched his arm lightly. Most people see something that needs doing, and they walk past it, tell themselves it's not their problem. You didn't walk past. You stopped, and you stayed, and you built something that's going to outlast both of us. They stood in comfortable silence, watching the donkeys settle in for the evening. Clementine was out in the pasture with a small group, her grey coat silver in the fading light. She'd become the unofficial mascot of the rescue. Her story featured in every article and interview. People drove from hours away just to see her, to meet the donkey who'd survived against all odds. I think about how close I came to not stopping that day, Silas said quietly. I'd driven past that barn 100 times. If I'd kept driving one more time, but you didn't, Pauline interrupted. That's the only version that matters. Silas closed his ledger and tucked it under his arm. The sun had dipped below the horizon now, leaving the sky streaked with purple and gold. In the distance he could hear the evening chorus of the donkeys calling to each other, a sound that had once spoken of neglect and suffering, but now just sounded like home. Come on, Pauline said. I brought pot roast, and it'll get cold if you stand out here much longer contemplating the universe. They walked back toward the house together, and Silas felt a contentment he'd never quite known before. His father's watch was still frozen at 3:47, still marking the moment when one man's fight had ended. But Silas's fight had ended differently, not in lonely defeat, but in community and connection, and the quiet certainty that his life had meant something after all. Behind them, Clementine lifted her head and brayed once, long and loud. And Silas smiled because he knew what she was saying. We're here. We made it. We're home.